Unit 3, Period 3, Section 6, the key features of the Constitution. In 1787, the delegates to the states met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. They decided to throw the Articles of Confederation in the trash can and start over with a new Constitution. One of the most influential people in this decision was James Madison. James Madison did not have an official capacity at the Constitutional Convention, but yet he felt like the secretary at the convention was not doing a very effective job of taking notes. So he began to sit near the front and began to record all the votes and the motions made on the floor at the convention. And then he would go back to his hotel room at night and take his shortened notes, his written notes, and transcribe them into longhand so that there would be an accurate recording of what went on at the Constitutional Convention. In order for the Constitution to eventually be ratified, there had to be some compromises. One of the compromises was between the large states and small states and became known as the Great Compromise. Under the Articles of Federation, the small states had enjoyed a lot of power because there were more small states of the 13 than there were large states. So since under the Articles, each state got one vote, the small states could always outnumber the large states. The argument by the large states, and here's a census map of the United States in 2010, the argument by the large states is that they had more population, they paid more in taxes, so they should have more of a say-so. The small states argued that that was not necessarily the case and that each state should have an equal vote, very similar to the way the Articles had been written. The compromise was one that called for a bicameral, or you need to know that that's a two-house Congress, and that there would be one house in which the population of a state would determine its representation, and then in the other house, called the Senate, each state would have an equal vote. Another key feature that had to be agreed upon at the Constitutional Convention was the idea that no one branch of government would become too powerful. And so, under the influence of a French philosopher named Baron de Montesquieu, James Madison helped organize the Constitution and the powers of the government into three branches. You have the executive branch, which is the president, the legislative branch, which is Congress, and the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court. The president is responsible for enforcing the laws, Congress is responsible for writing the laws, and the judicial branch is responsible for interpreting the laws. The third key feature of the new U.S. Constitution was that the power of the national government would be limited. It would be limited by a process known as checks and balances, that each branch of government would have powers and rights above the other branch. The example that I want you to remember is the idea of a presidential veto. And that is that the president can, here it is, that a president can take legislation passed by 535 men and women in Congress, and one individual can veto that legislation. Now, in your government class, you learned that in the Constitution, they allowed for Congress to overturn a veto with more votes, but it's a very difficult process to do that. The fourth compromise at the Constitutional Convention was over the issue of slavery, and it became known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. When the South learned that it could have more votes in the House of Representatives if more of its population was counted, it proposed that it be able to use its slaves in its population of its states. The North said that that was not good and opposed this. But the North countered that if they would be willing to allow the South to count their slaves if they taxed their slaves at a fair amount. And the South said they disagreed with this. The final agreement was that 3/5 or 60% of the slaves would be counted in a southern state for the purposes of increasing representation in the House of Representatives for that state, but also the southern slave owners would have to pay taxes on 3 of every 5 slaves. This is known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. The last and final key feature of the Constitution is the idea of the Electoral College. And that is how our forefathers felt like we should elect our presidents. That is by taking the population of a state as represented by the number of representatives in the House of Representatives and Congress and the number of senators that each state has, adding those two numbers together would give that state its electoral vote. In order for a president to win the election, they would have to receive a majority of the electoral votes. Today, that's 270. This would ensure that more people's feelings about who is to be elected president would be heard using the electoral process. The members to the Electoral College who are elected by the popular vote in each state are not required by the Constitution to vote for the person that they have agreed to vote for. They do have the option of voting for whoever they want to. Very rarely does this happen. In every case except for 5, the American people's popular vote has elected the president. There's been 5 situations, 5 elections where a president has lost the popular vote, but won the presidency because of the Electoral College. This concludes period 3, section 6, over key features of the Constitution.